Nick Schenck, out in New York, running this factory, serving up these lollipops to what they used to call the bread and circuses for the.
Now you listen to me, Buster. Nick Schenck in the studio have been good to you and to everyone else who works here. If I ever hear you bad-mouthing Mr. Schenck again, it'll be the last thing you say before I have you tossed in jail for colluding in your own abduction.
Eddie, I would never do that.
Shut up.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Hollywood's golden age was defined by Jewish immigrant moguls. Men like Samuel Goldwyn, Carl Laemmle, Louis B. Mayer, and William Fox. But there were two brothers, also Jewish immigrants, who stood above them all. Yet they also stood behind the scenes. Their rags to riches roller coaster story is the subject of a lively new book.
We're happy to chat with Michael Benson, the author of more than 60 nonfiction history and true crime books. His latest is Moguls, The Lives and Times of Film Pioneers Nicholas and Joseph Schenck, co-written with Craig Singer. Michael, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thanks for having me, guys.
The Schenck brothers are mentioned here and there in histories of old Hollywood, but you're the first to take a deep dive into their stories, warts and all. How did you go about researching this book?
Well, I have to admit that when Craig first came to me with this project, and Craig's a popular film director, which is why he's not here. He's in a post-production meeting in a very important major motion picture. When he came to me with this project, I had no idea who Joe and Nick Schenck were. I had never heard of them, and the fact that I had never heard of them bothered me. It bothered me that you could be this successful in America and be almost completely forgotten after 60, 70 years. And there were reasons for that, which I guess we'll get to. But researching was hard. I had to pick up little pieces from all of those other references in other history books. I got really lucky one day when I found out that Joe Schenck gave a lengthy interview to Liberty Magazine, which was a magazine, the newsstand magazine popular in the 40s, and gave great details about coming over on the boat, being a newsie, standing on the corner, extra, how got his first job in a Chinese drugstore, which pretty much dished out morphine to gang members who were injured in the Tong Wars. And the rags to riches story is pretty much spelled out. And what he didn't say, it gave me a trellis of bones to put meat on until I had a full body. Craig was in charge of the family. I was in charge of the business. I also used newspaper morgues because at one time or another, both Schenck brothers were in the newspapers a lot. Nick, when he was running Palisades Amusement Park, he was kind of a P.T. Barnum, kind of a Carney Barker type with his cane and his boater running around and being very, very popular guy in New Jersey. And Joe, ironically enough, in the 1940s when he was in trouble for tax evasion and titillated America with by deducting from his taxes a ménage à trois. Many Americans didn't know what ménage à trois meant until Joe Schenck tried to deduct one on his income taxes, and it was brought out in a most humorous way by the prosecution at his trial. They marched these girls down, and they're all wearing mink coats that Joe gave them. And they would give the date that they were in the hotel. And then the second one gave the date she was in the hotel. We said, wait a second, isn't that the same date as the previous witness? And everyone, a couple of women fainted. So they were in the newspapers a lot during different parts of their lives. And Joe had a chance of being a person that was remembered forever because of this, it was the biggest story of the year, except for on December 7th, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and all news stories were wiped clean, and America thought about nothing but World War II for 4 years. And by the time of VJ Day, everybody had forgotten about Joe and his tax problems. One time I got lucky. My wife was reading the memoirs of Shelley Winters, fantastic actress. Maybe gave the greatest performance of all times in Lolita. Um, and she was Marilyn Monroe's roommate during the time when Marilyn was Joe Scank's special friend. And we get a lot of insight into Joe's character. Yeah, you hate to say this, but the Me Too movement has tended to lump together casting couch owners as all creeps, and Joe was not a creep. Joe, if a woman didn't want to go into his casting room with him, he would pat her on the hand. He'd give her the contract. I mean, she was wanted to be an actress. She'd get the minimum contract with 20th Century Fox. She didn't get the fur. You had to go into the casting room to get the fur. But, there was no rape. There was no coercion. There's no, your career is going to be ruined if you don't do me. Um, there was none of that. And Maureen O'Sullivan uh, gave him a tremendous rave. She said, I know he was a guy with a lot of girlfriends, and he wanted me as a girlfriend too. And I said, no, he couldn't have been nicer. And anyway, Joe and Marilyn had a very special relationship that went on for many years, long after the sex was over. And I found out about it from Shelley Winters. So I mean, the research was piecemeal, and it lasted for more than a decade. And in the end, I thought we came up with a pretty good book. We came up with two books, really. We wrote one that was, first version had a lot more about business dealings, how the men went from being poor to being, in the top 10 richest men in America. Um, and test readers said, it's okay. It's really interesting, but we like the scandal stuff better. So much like a Hollywood producer would do, we cut back on the stuff that people didn't care about and put in the stuff they liked.
You note that Joseph and Nicholas Schenck were the most powerful brothers in Hollywood, more than twice as powerful as the Warner Brothers. They were the power behind many of the moguls and entertainers who we would recognize by name. Why aren't they better known?
Because their name was Schenck, they never used their name in any logos or trademarks. When Nick Schenck unexpectedly found himself running Lowe's Inc., which owned MGM, um, he could have changed the name to Schenck Inc. We could have had Schenck Theaters, of Schenck Studios, but none of that happened. He kept the name of Marcus Lowe on everything. We still have Lowe's Theaters. Um, all MGM pictures for 30 years. If you look at the really tiny print during the credits, it always says controlled by Lowe's Inc. That's so, Nick could have put his name in the credits of every one of those movies, but chose not to. Um, yeah, I think one of the reasons is that Joe's notoriety was cut short by World War II. And with Nick, it was intentional. He paid a publicist to keep his name out of the newspapers. He trained his family not to talk, there's still not talking. Like I said, Craig was in charge of the family. He kept them from getting in our way in any way, and they didn't really disapprove of us, but they didn't help us either. Now, luckily for us, there's absolutely no indication that Nick's home life was anything interesting. He basically wanted to keep a clean nest. Now, it occurred to me while I was writing the book that Hollywood was a social experiment unlike any that had ever happened in civilization before. It was a colony of entirely good-looking people, with the predictable results being that there were a lot of sexual excesses and it turned into a cesspool. And Nick didn't want his lovely wife, Pansy, and his two beautiful daughters anywhere near that. So they lived in a Gatsby-like mansion on the North Shore of Long Island. And he sent spies over to make sure that the guys at MGM were doing what he told them to do.
For members of our audience who are unfamiliar with the Schenck brothers, which is probably most of them, what projects would be most associated with them?
Well, early Joe Schenck produced movies by Buster Keaton, some of the greatest comedies ever made. He was the producer for Fatty Arbuckle, and that the scandal that ended Arbuckle's career taught Joe a big lesson. He produced Norma Talmadge pictures, which were the romances. He was married to Norma Talmadge. Norma Jean, who became Marilyn Monroe, is named after Norma Talmadge. And Nick, MGM, he was a charter investor in Technicolor, and in 1939 sort of debuted it in major motion pictures for America with two projects. Maybe you've heard of them. One's The Wizard of Oz, Open the Door, We're Not in Kansas Anymore, Technicolor, holy cow. And the other was Gone with the Wind, with the burning of Atlanta, which just must have been mind-boggling to people who had been watching black and white movies for 20 years.
Yeah, I never heard of those films.
Yeah, right. Right. And Joe invented the Academy Awards. Yeah. And while we're having the banquet, we should give out some awards too. And the Oscars were born.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. The first book listed in your bibliography is Kenneth Anger's controversial classic, Hollywood Babylon, which details scandals of famous Hollywood personalities from the early 1900s to the 1950s. Your book also has a wonderful tabloid quality with mobsters, private eyes, murders, gambling, tax evasion, parties, and sex. It must have been fun to write, yes?
Well, they tell you write what you know. Craig and I are historians, but we're not dusty historians. He makes motion pictures that are for grown-ups and horror movies. I've had kind of a Damon Runyon life. I don't know if everybody knows who Damon Runyon is anymore. He wrote Guys and Dolls and Pocket Full of Miracles and stories about the gangsters hanging around Times Square. Although he wasn't allowed to call it Times Square because he wrote for the Hearst papers. As a young man, you could find me at the fights, and I was out at the racetrack and at the ballpark and maybe in several taverns around town. So and I've written for boxing magazines. I was Bert Sugar's editor for Bert Sugar's Fight Game magazine for a few years. So, and now I write mob books. So, with the exception of sex, all of those things you listed, I'm pretty much an expert in. Yeah, you have to ask somebody else for the other one. Even the original version that people said too much business, it still wasn't a dusty history book with a lot of footnotes and stuff. It was still pretty lightly written, and that's what we're good at. And so I think that the tone was also shaped by a book I had written earlier called Gangsters versus Nazis, which was about the Jewish gangsters of the Depression era who busted up German-American Bund meetings and saved America. And nobody knew about it because it was Meyer Lansky and his crew, and they didn't want publicity either. So that's it. It's a fun book, and Hollywood was like that. I mean, by the way, Anger's book is first in my bibliography because his name is Anger. It starts with an A. Although I really am fond of the book. I think that the whole idea of taking a scandal sheet and turning it into high art is a very, very interesting way of going about creating a book. And it shows. Everybody's read it, right? And it's the first time you saw the Black Dahlia. Ooh.
You write early in the book that the Schenck brothers' story would make a great movie, and you prove it by interspersing imagined scenes with dialogue and stage directions, typeset in screenplay format. What did your publisher think of this unorthodox approach?
The publisher didn't mention it, so I suspect they approve. And my thinking was that the book is so much of the movies that occasionally it becomes a movie. I think readers like it. I mean, you're reading a book and it stays in sequence. You're reading a book and then suddenly you're watching a movie that's of the book you're reading. And then it goes back to being a book again. And maybe 4 or 5 times it pops out and all of a sudden you're seeing it on a screen, which is just fun. And it gave us a chance to play with our screenwriter's license. Writing long conversations between Buster Keaton and Joe Schenck when he's an old man. Obviously, we weren't in the room. We didn't have a tape recorder, but we're aware of the attitudes they're expressing, so we allow them to express them in that form. I don't see it as cheating at all. If you want to dispense your information to your readers in terms of dialogue, it seems like your option as the creator who outranks all the author. That's basically it. And to be fair, we didn't always think it was going to be a book. For the first few years, Craig wanted to make a movie, uh, but we didn't get any nibbles that way. Gangsters versus Nazis became a bestseller, and Kensington Books said, "Pick a subject, carte blanche. What do you want to write next?" And I said, "I've had this thing kicking around for 8 years now, called Moguls about the Skanks." They said, "Who?" And you'll find out, because that's what we're doing next.
Yeah, any ideas to develop it into a screenplay proper?
Well, obviously, it is available to be optioned in that way. We have plans to, and this is I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about this. This is scoop. There are plans to turn it into a Broadway musical. I don't know what stage that's at. I've lost track. I'm doing other things, but yeah, it's the theater is interested in maybe doing the Skank story, not just because it's a film history, but because it's really a history of the 20th century. I mean, it does take you through people coming over on the boat and all the way through uh, the 60s. I think it goes until the 60s. And during that time, the Skanks battle enemies who mirror America's issues. During the Depression, they have to battle the Nazis who want to take over Hollywood and turn it into a propaganda machine. Um, they battled s- anti-Semite Southern congressmen and senators who think that Hollywood should be Christian. Um, and they win. They battle the mob. The mob wants to come in and take a bite out of the Hollywood apple, and Joe comes up with a scheme. And this I found that a lot of really, really successful men um, came up with a scheme where everybody makes money. So defeated the mob in that way, and that didn't really get rid of them. And it wasn't until the 50s that they ran into an enemy that they couldn't beat, and that was television. Um, TV changed the way America took its entertainment, the same way that movies changed people away from going to vaudeville. It was just the next phase, and instead of seeing it as a investment opportunity, which I think the young skanks would have done, they would have immediately gotten a contract so that the newfangled TV would show nothing but MGM movies or something like that. But they didn't. They saw them as competition, and that was their downfall.
One of the names that appears throughout the book is notorious Hollywood fixer Eddie Mannix. Our audience might know him from the Coen brothers movie Hail Caesar, where he's fictionalized as tough but morally upright. In real life, he was very tough, but certainly not a mensch. Mannix was a part of Nick Skank's inner circle. Could you tell us about that?
You mentioned the Coen brothers movie, Hail Caesar. If you remember correctly, Eddie Maggs keeps sneaking off and getting on the phone and talking to Mr. Skank. That's Nick, where he's talking to Nick, and they got the pronunciation right. Um, Eddie Mannix is a fascinating character. Yeah, not a mensch. He met Nick. Nick caught him stealing from Palisades Park, and another very New York businessman attitude. Instead of calling the cops on Eddie, he talked to him a little while and realized that Eddie's got a brain on his shoulders, handles numbers very well. He runs numbers for the mob is his side hustle. And Nick says, we'd rather have you steal for us than from us, and hires him. And Eddie becomes the troubleshooter at the park, and security kicks out people who are in fights. He handles the books, probably both sets. And when Nick unexpectedly finds himself in charge of Lowe's Inc., he sends Eddie out to Hollywood, makes him like third in command at MGM. He's I forget the exact title now, but he's the executive in charge of being in charge of stuff. And he gets a big office, and his job basically is to make sure that Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg or the brains behind the movies there, do exactly what Nick says. Eddie Mannix is, he reads every telegram going in and out of the studio. Nothing happens without him knowing about it. And probably his most important job is he and Howard Stripling, who happens to be the guy who invented the Leo the Lion logo originally for Metro Pictures, but later became MGM's logo. They become the fixers. Now, one of the scandals that we talk about extensively in the book is the 1921 scandal of Fatty Arbuckle, Roscoe Arbuckle, went to a party in San Francisco and locked himself into a hotel room with a woman who ended up dead. And her name was Virginia Rappe, Rappe. Very unfortunate spelling, but every time it appeared in a headline, all Americans thought the same thing. It's one P too many. And she died of a punctured bladder. So, and as one doctor at the time said, bladders don't puncture themselves. So the Hearst papers, every time they would run a story about the scandal, they would put a long neck beer bottle picture. Just horrible, horrible. Anyway, Joe ends up pays for Roscoe's defense. There's 3 trials. He's eventually acquitted, but like maybe a Bill Cosby of today, or an O.J. Simpson, he's no longer viable as a show business entity. He doesn't quite get it. But Joe, I was acquitted. Why can't I go back to work? Well, America no longer finds you funny. I mean, the second we put you in the context of squishing a poor girl in a hotel room, that big moon face of yours goes from being hysterical to grotesque. Anyway, it cost Joe millions and millions of dollars, mostly in movies that Arbuckle didn't make. And Buster Keaton took his place, made great pictures, but they're far more expensive than Arbuckle pictures were to make. So they came up with a system, the fixer system. And the deal was, and I think the LAPD was in on this to a certain extent, they're bought off. That if something happened, somebody died, if there was a scandal, the fixers would get there first. And so that by the time the police and the reporters arrived, there would be a scene that nobody could make sense out of. Thus, you get a lot of suicides. There were probably actually murders. Thelma Todd, suicide, even though she's all covered with bruises. Paul Byrne, Jean Harlow's milquetoast husband, he's found dead, and then there's this kind of a pathetic note that blames his suicide on sexual inadequacy or something like that. But anyway, these are all confused scenes and designed to get the press past it onto something else, so that it doesn't cost the studios quite so much money. And that was Eddie Mannix's job, and he was just a really scary guy, and had no talk about not being a mensch. He was amoral. His first wife, he had a girlfriend named Tony who was a Ziegfeld girl. She had $1 million legs, so they said. And his first wife, who apparently only had $100,000 legs, got run off the road on a major LA highway. Went down the cliff like they do in the movies, and died. And the police saw that it looked like she'd been sideswiped by a second car just before she went over, but they rule it an accident. So I don't know if Eddie got in on that or not, but the fact that it was Eddie's wife probably told the cops that we probably shouldn't look into this too closely. And Eddie's impact on show business lasts right through to the 50s, when George Reeves, the guy who played Superman on television, commits suicide. Only the first bullet misses, and very, very strange circumstances. George Reeves was living in a house that Eddie had purchased for Tony, his second wife. Tony had George Reeves as her boy toy, and it was an agreement. Eddie also had the maid was his girlfriend. When they went away on vacation, Tony and Eddie would sit together, and George and the maid would sit in the back of the plane, and then they would go their appropriate ways once they got to the destination. But what happens is George Reeves leaves Tony for another woman and stays in the house that Mannix bought. So he's a dead man. So there's your Eddie Mannix story. It's funny in the Coen brothers movie Hail Caesar, he's kind of the hero. You get no sense, and you get to see Tony, his second wife, briefly, and she's a beautiful blonde, but she's wearing an apron and she's in the kitchen. So it's no indication that she was once a Ziegfeld girl at all, or her actual character.
I can't figure out why exactly the Coen brothers decided to rehabilitate Eddie Mannix in that film.
No, I mean, the real Eddie Mannix would make such a great movie. But I guess it's a comedy. The Coen brothers like to keep it light. So, bumping off first wives, oh, only Quentin Tarantino can turn bumping off a wife into comedy.
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing about that film is that Eddie's moral dilemma is at the center of the film, but as you're describing him, he had no morals.
Right. Oh, right. Oh, that's completely fictitious. Yeah, he's just going around threatening people. It's he's the head of Blackmail R Us.
Well, as you mentioned, the Schenck brothers pushed back against anti-Semitism, both in their own lives. They had no tolerance for anti-Jewish slurs or attitudes, and in helping to thwart an attempted Nazi takeover of the film industry. What role did their Jewish identities play during their careers?
They went into the business they went into because of the many industries they weren't allowed to go into. They invented a business. And it's interesting because we can trace the motion picture industry to a single lunch in a Midtown Manhattan restaurant. And it's got Joe and Nick Schenck are there. Marcus Lowe is there. Jesse Lasky, Adolf Zukor, and they're all sitting at the table together, and they're discussing the new motion pictures because they're being shown during vaudeville shows in between acts, and the waves are coming up, and the audiences are ducking because the railroad train's coming right over them, and I believe it's Zukor who says it's a gimmick only because we're treating it that way. What we should be doing is using it to tell stories, to make people feel emotions, and that one day we'll be making moving pictures that are as long as a play on Broadway. And those, oh, no one will ever sit for that long. But it all comes true. And those men at that one lunch, they go on to run MGM, 20th Century Fox, United Artists, and Paramount. We left out Universal, Columbia, and Warner Brothers. They had their own lunch. But it's amazing. Anti-Semites in the 20th century loved to use the word clout. And during the Depression, they got people paranoid that the reason you're poor is because the Jews have all the money, they control everything, and if we could wipe them out, we'll be on easy street once again. Which is a horrible thing, and that forced the Jewish moguls in Hollywood to really take steps to stop that. But up until then, there was nothing about the product that would indicate that these were Jewish men making the movies. This is the very special Christmas episode of the Hardy family, and it's all the small towns tended to look like St. John's, Ontario, where Louis B. Mayer grew up. And that would be small town America. But nothing terribly Jewish. It's just the jazz singer is a Jewish subject, which is interesting that the transition film gives you a little peek into the bios of the men who are making these movies for the first time, really. Their Jewishness is not terribly important until the anti-Semitism of the 30s, and they get a bad rap. Not just the Skanks, but the other moguls as well, because they continued doing business in Germany even after Hitler took power. And I've read history books that call them, betrayers of their people. Well, the truth of the matter was they were taking care of matters a lot closer to home. One of the first things Hitler did when he took power was he sent agents to California, tried to infiltrate the movies with the idea that if we could turn the big studios into propaganda machines for Nazism, make anti-English movies, anti-Russian movies, and pro-Hitler movies, that they might be able to take care of America without firing a shot, win the hearts and minds of America. Well, it didn't work because the Moguls, including the Skanks, Joe in particular, financed a undercover intervention. The Jewish and Gentile spies infiltrated German American Bund meetings, silver shirt meetings, all the fascist meetings that were going on, found out the plans that were being made, include some really horrible things they had in mind. Um, to kill Charlie Chaplin, to kill Louis B. Mayer was a major target, and none of it happened because when the Nazis would show up to execute their mission, they would find the police were there waiting for them, and they could never figure out who the mole was. So they saved America from the inside, and as soon as their employees in Germany started having troubles, they got out. They only hung in until I think Harry Warner's good friend was killed in a bombing in Berlin, and after that, everybody came home, and soon after that, the war started, and the question of American allegiance was no longer an issue.
What are some of the lessons you learned from piecing together the incredible lives of Nicholas and Joseph Schenck?
Yeah, one thing I learned, the whole rap on Moguls, being, bad Jews because they worked with the Nazis for a while in Germany, all BS. Uh, I found out that power sometimes exchanges hands in kind of minute ways. When Marcus Lowe passed away, he was a young man, he was in his 50s, and his widow asked Nick to run the company and said, "I'll sell you my stock so you are both the chairman and the majority stockholder, but on one condition alone." And they said, "Whatever you want, whatever you want." And she said, "Don't fire John Gilbert. He's my favorite." And so it became one of the toughest tasks in Nick's early career running Lowe's Inc. was keeping Louis B. Mayer from firing John Gilbert, who was a drunk and washed up. Um, I the problem didn't last long because John Gilbert eventually drank himself to death, and Louis B. Mayer figured out that he could just give Gilbert really small parts, without firing him, and too bad he's making him, $100,000 a picture. He's only got 4 lines, but that's the way it's gotta be because, Mrs. Lowe says so. I learned haunted house pictures are all based on Bugsy Siegel's home. Bugsy Siegel and Joe Schenck were neighbors, and Bugsy said, "Joe, come on over. I wanna show you some stuff." And he showed him the you pull out the book on the bookcase and it slides away and there's a hidden passageway. All these ways he's gonna get away if the house is raided. It's got the painting with the holes so that you can look out from a secret room. And Joe loves this. He immediately goes back, puts it in his own mansion next door, only his secret passageway goes to his casting room. I found out, lesson learned, there were no concession stands in movie theaters, in the cinema, until the 50s. The movie was considered enough. Your perk was you got to watch the movie in a palace that looked like Versailles, which is another one of Marcus Lowe's odd business thing is people will enjoy the movie so much more if it's in a zillion-dollar theater that, and the ones that are still standing are just here in Brooklyn, we have the Kings, which was recently redone, and it's just unbelievable. Then 1929 came and then the stock market crashed. And from then on, movie theaters have gotten increasingly cheaper every decade ever since, until now, if there's a nice movie theater, it's got 17 screens in there. Getting back to Marilyn Monroe, because people love this part. Marilyn Monroe and Joe Schenck were friends during a later part of his life when he'd lost some of his vitality, as they say. And he was seeking medical attention that might prove to be an early version of Viagra. And most of those guys, he kicked the heck out. But one guy had an injection that worked for maybe 5 minutes. So Marilyn, being his favorite, moved into a bungalow behind his house because, as Marilyn later told Shelley Winters, there was no time to put me in a car and come across town. Why? So then there was a problem when she went from the bungalow to the house. The word paparazzi wasn't used yet, but it was the guys from Confidential magazine who were looking for scandals would take a picture. So Joe had a tunnel built from his casting room to her bungalow so she could come and go without being seen by the outside world. It's pretty fascinating stuff. But I mean, the entire book is things you didn't know before. And if people are put off by the fact that they don't know who Joe and Nick Schenck are, they're the only people in the book you're going to not have heard of. Everybody else is famous. They were the money people behind the scenes. Nick was the boss of Louis B. Mayer, and Joe was the boss of Darryl F. Zanuck. And the two production heads were thought of I think they were thought of by America as the owners of those studios, but they were not. And if you want to see who else owned stock in those studios, you'd find it very, very incestuous. Nick owned a lot of stock in Joe's studios, and Joe owned a lot of stock in Lowe's Inc. So, I mean, when they eventually came looking at those guys, still worried that they were unchristian, but saying, well, it's a monopoly. Well, they had a point. It was a monopoly. Basically, those guys at the lunch table still owned everything.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, guys.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.